On a cold November afternoon, Sophie Whitmore stepped into a small charity shop tucked away on a quiet London street. Rain had been falling since morning, and she only wanted somewhere warm to wait before catching her bus home. She had no intention of buying anything. The shop was crowded with old furniture, books, and rows of second-hand clothes that carried the faint smell of perfume and dust. Sophie slowly walked past the clothing racks. Then she noticed a long, dark green wool coat hanging alone at the end of one rack. Something about it made her stop. The coat looked old but elegant. Its velvet collar was slightly faded, and one of the wooden buttons had a small crack across it. Sophie lifted it from the hanger. It was surprisingly heavy and warm. She tried it on. It was a little too large for her, but somehow it felt strangely comfortable. She looked at herself in the mirror for reasons she could not explain. She felt as though she had worn it before. She checked the price tag, £7. Sophie smiled and took it to the counter. The elderly shop assistant looked at the coat and became unusually quiet. She studied Sophie for a moment before speaking. "That coat has been here for a very long time." Sophie smiled. "Oh, you know who owned it?" The woman shook her head. "No, dear, it was donated many years ago. Nobody ever came looking for it." Sophie paid for the coat and carried it home. That evening she hung it beside her bedroom door. She forgot about it until the following morning. Sophie reached into the coat pocket while looking for her keys. Her fingers touched something underneath the lining. She frowned. There was something hidden inside. She turned the coat over and carefully examined the stitching near the lower seam. She discovered a tiny opening, almost impossible to notice. As Sophie pulled it apart, a secret pocket appeared. Inside was a small silver key and a folded piece of yellow paper. Her heart began to beat faster. She unfolded the paper. Only 6 words had been written across it: "If you found this, forgive." Sophie stared at the message. Then she turned the paper over. There was another letter: Room 21, Harrington Hotel. Sophie slowly looked at the silver key in her hand. She had bought an old coat for £7, but somehow she had also bought a secret, and now that secret was waiting for her to uncover it. Sophie spent most of the morning searching for the Harrington Hotel. At first she thought it might still be operating, but every search led to the same discovery: the hotel had closed almost 30 years earlier. It had once been one of London's most respected hotels. Then one winter night a fire destroyed part of the building. Several rooms were damaged and an employee disappeared, and the hotel never reopened. Sophie read the old newspaper reports carefully. A name appeared again and again: Elena Valia, young woman who had worked at the hotel. She had disappeared on the night of the funeral. No body had ever been found. Another name appeared beside her: Julian Mercer, Eleanor's close friend. According to the newspapers, the two had argued shortly before the fire. Julian had been questioned by police, but no evidence was ever found against him. Sophie looked at the silver key. Room 21. She knew she should leave the mystery alone, but she could not. 4 days later she traveled to the abandoned hotel. Building stood behind a row of overgrown trees. Its windows were broken. The walls were covered in ivy. The old hotel sign still hung above the entrance: Harrington Hotel. Sophie pushed the front door. It opened slowly. Inside was complete silence. Dust covered the reception desk. Old furniture stood beneath white sheets. She found the staircase and climbed to the second floor. The corridor was dark. Room numbers were still fixed beside the doors: 18th. Then she saw a 21. Sophie took the key from her coat. Her hand trembled as she placed it inside the locked key. Turned immediately. The door opened. The room was small and almost completely empty. An old wooden desk stood beside the window. A broken lamp rested on the floor, and beside the wall was a photograph covered in dust. Sophie picked it up. It showed a young woman smiling beside a man. The woman was wearing the same dark green coat, the exact coat Sophie was wearing. On the back of the photograph was a date: October 14, 1990, and beneath the date were 2 names: Elena and Julian. Sophie felt a chill move through her. She turned toward the desk. Something had been carved into the wood. She brushed away the dust. Words slowly became visible: She promised she would return. Sophie stepped backward. Then she noticed an old drawer beneath the desk. Inside was a yellow envelope. Written across the front were 3 words: "For the truth." Sophie opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings about the fire, but there was one Photograph missing from the collection. The empty space had been marked with a handwritten note. He knows where she went. Sophie looked around the abandoned room. Simeon had known the truth and someone had deliberately hidden it. Sophie returned home carrying the photograph and the newspaper clipping. She barely slept that night. The face of Eleanor Vale remained in her mind. Next morning, Sophie examined the old coat again, searched every pocket, every seam, and every button. Then she noticed something unusual inside the collar. There was another hidden opening. Sophie carefully pulled the stitching apart. A tiny folded piece of paper fell onto the floor. It contained an address, 36 Rosewood Lane. Sophie searched the address on Lyneth House still existed. It was less than an hour away. That afternoon she went there. An elderly man opened the door. His name was Malcolm Reed. The moment he saw the photograph Sophie was holding, his expression changed. "Where did you get that?" Sophie told him everything. The Koth Room 20 and the hidden letter. Malcolm remained silent for several seconds. Then he opened the door wider. "Come inside." The living room was filled with old photographs. Malcolm pointed toward one of them. That was Eleanor. He worked at the Harrington Hotel. He knew her well. Sophie asked him what had really happened that night. Malcolm looked toward the window. Eleanor had discovered something. Zomion at the hotel had been stealing money from guests. Found records that could prove it. Planned to take those records to the police, but someone discovered what she was doing. She became frightened. Sophie asked about Julian. Malcolm shook his head. Julian was trying to protect her. Was not the person who betrayed her. Then Malcolm walked toward an old wooden cabinet, opened a drawer, and removed a small metal box. Inside was a letter. Eleanor had written it only hours before the fire. Sophie carefully unfolded. Eleanor explained everything she had hidden the evidence inside room 21. She believed someone was following her. She also wrote about Julian. She said he had promised to help her escape. But then Sophie reached the final line. "If I disappear, tell Julian that I never stopped loving him." Sophie lowered the letter. "What happened to Julian?" Malcolm looked away. "He waited for her for years." She believed Eleanor had left him and never knew she had been trying to save both of them. Sophie felt tears in her eyes, but Malcolm had not finished. There was something else he had kept hidden, something he had never told anyone. I looked at Sophie and whispered, "Eleanor did not die that night." Sophie froze. "She was alive." Malcolm nodded. "She escaped London before anyone could find her, and she left something behind, something that was meant to be found." Malcolm walked slowly to another cabinet. From the bottom drawer he removed a second envelope. This one was much older. Placed it in front of Sophie. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of Eleanor standing outside a small cottage. Its back contained a new name, Margaret Ellis. Malcolm explained that Eleanor had changed her name after leaving London. She had moved to the north of England and lived a quiet life. She never returned to London. She never contacted Julian. She believed that staying away was the only way to keep him safe. Sophie looked at the photograph. Did she never tell him she was alive?" Malcolm's voice became quiet because she believed someone was still watching her. "For years Eleanor waited. Eventually she became Margaret Ellis. Marriage, had children. She lived a completely different life, but according to Malcolm, she never forgot Julian. She kept one photograph of him until the day she died." Sophie looked down at the letter in her hands. "When did she die?" Malcolm answered softly. 3 months ago." Sophie felt a deep sadness. After 30 years, Eleanor had finally disappeared from the world, but her secret had survived. Inside an old coat, inside a hidden pocket, waiting for someone to find it. Malcolm then handed Sophie one final envelope. This was found with her belongings. If he opened it, inside was a short handwritten message. She had not written it for Julian. She had written it for whoever discovered the Koth. Message said that sometimes people hide the truth because they believe silence will protect the people they love, but silence can also become a prison. Sophie folded the letter. Then she noticed one final detail. There was another name written at the bottom, Julian Mercer. Malcolm looked at her. "Never knew Eleanor survived?" Sophie asked where Julian was now. Malcolm took a deep breath. "Died 8 years ago." Sophie closed her eyes. For 30 years, two people had loved each other. Both had believed the other was gone, and neither had ever known the truth. Sophie returned home that evening with the old coat folded carefully. In her arms she placed it on the chair beside her window. For the first time she understood why it had always felt different. It was not simply an old coat, it had carried someone's fearsomeness, hope, and someone's final attempt to tell the truth. Following morning, Sophie returned to the charity shop. She wanted to thank the elderly shop assistant who had sold it to her, but when she entered the shop the woman looked surprised. "You came back, Sophie? No, Daddy wanted to ask you something." "Wo donated the coat." Woman looked at the coat for a long moment, then she smiled sadly. "A gentleman brought it here many years ago. Ha told me one thing before leaving. One day someone will find what she left behind." Sophie felt a shiver. "Do you remember his name?" The woman shook her head. "No, dear, but I remember his final words," said the coat was never really lost. It was only waiting." Sophie looked down at the old green coat and for the first time she smiled because after 30 years Selena's secret had finally found its way home.